Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you're joining from. Welcome to the K-Town 92 screening, demonstration, and discussion, the first of 3 events being held this week as part of the Revisiting the LA Riots 30 Years Later series, commemorating the 30th anniversary of the LA Uprising, an event known by an event that Korean Americans refer to as Saiku. I'm Stefan Chosa, an assistant professor of sociology and women's ethnic studies at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs, or UCCS, and I will serve as the host and moderator throughout this series. I'm currently broadcasting live from the unceded territories of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, Lakota, Pueblo, and Shoshone peoples and nations known otherwise as the state of Colorado. Today's virtual event is supported by the following groups and offices at UCCS: the Social Sciences Symposium Series, the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Global Intercultural Research Center, or GLINT, and the Matrix Center. Thank you all sincerely for your support. We're joined today from Los Angeles by 2 very special guests, both of whom were centrally involved in the creation of K-Town 92, as well as the reporter's mini documentary that we began with. Grace Lee is an independent filmmaker who most recently produced and directed 2 episodes of the Peabody Award-winning Asian Americans series, as well as And She Could Be Next, POV's first broadcast series about women of color transforming politics and civic engagement, which was nominated for an NAACP Image Award. Other credits include the Peabody-winning American Revolutionary, The Evolution of Grace Lee Boggs, The Grace Lee Project, Makers, Women in Politics, and Off the Menu, Asian America, both for PBS, and the K-Town 92 project, an interactive online project about the 92 Los Angeles civil unrest, as well as many others. She is co-founder of the Asian American Documentary Network, or ADOC, a Directors Guild of America member, as well as a member of the documentary branch of the Academy of Motion Pictures, Arts and Sciences. She's also host and executive producer of a podcast investigating systemic inequities at PBS called Viewers Like Us. Yuri Chung is a Peabody Award-winning documentary producer focused on Asian American stories. Leading Flash Cuts, a legacy Asian American media company with Walt Louis, she has supported filmmakers for over 15 years in all phases of production. Projects include Plague at the Golden State for American Experience, currently in post-production, Asian Americans, a 5-hour docuseries, the digital series A People's History of Asian America, and the May 19th Solidarity Project, part of the Asian American Foundation's See Us Unite initiative. She was the producer for the K-Town 92 interactive online project. Let's give both speakers a warm welcome. I will note that many of their films are available to stream for free through the UCCS library, including the excellent Asian Americans documentary series, which aired on PBS in 2020. I will include a link of the documentary series and the reporter's mini doc in the chat for UCCS students, faculty, and staff to view at their own leisure. The next 40 minutes will be dedicated to the discussion and demonstration of the K-Town 92 interactive documentary. I'll begin with a series of questions introducing the film to the audience, but this is meant to be an interactive experience, so viewers are encouraged to ask their own questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, not the chat function, the Q&A function, and we will try to respond to the questions in the order that they are received. So without further ado, Grace Lee and Yuri Chung.
Hi, thanks so much for having us. Yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us today. As I mentioned before, I have a few questions that I wanted to begin with before we jump into the demonstration. The first question is a pretty big one. What is K-Town 92? And I guess more specifically, what were your goals and vision for the project?
You want to start, Yuri?
Sure. I think the origin of the project was really at the 25th anniversary when we had heard that there were just so many feature film projects happening, right, Grace? Like there were just like a Showtime and Nat Geo, and like we just knew that there are all these commemorative documentaries happening, but none of them approached, none of them were being led by a person of Latino or Korean descent. So they were mainly being told by white directors and one African American director. And we just didn't have the time, or I guess by the time we really decided to do the project, it was clear we could not, make it April 2017 deadline with a feature film. So we kind of just collaborated in realizing that we should maybe do something that was more feasible in the time that we had and the budget that we had, which at the time was kind of zero. And we decided to see what we could do with web-based, kind of more interactive project.
I mean, I would just backtrack a little bit. As somebody who is, I was right out of college when 1992 happened, so you can figure out how old I am. And so over the years, like it was a really shocking event, for so many communities, but particularly as a Korean American, like if you can imagine never seeing like Koreans on television ever, except for like TV show MASH, or Korean Americans, Koreans living in America, to see suddenly these images beaming across the globe of like Koreatown burning and, shopkeepers, and some of the image we just saw in the film. It was a really profoundly like moving and traumatic experience for so many people. That actually shaped a lot of how I wanted to make films moving forward, or I was just getting interested in filmmaking at that time. And so as someone who sort of lived through like the 5-year anniversary, the 10-year, the 15-year, every time there would be an anniversary of this event, the same images would be recycled over and over again. And those images are highly problematic and never given any context, as Tammy Drummond says in the short film. So that was also kind of the real, not just like, let's make something and like, what can we do with our budget, but like, what is the why behind making this project?
Thank you both for your responses. I had just one brief follow-up question before we jump into a demonstration of the website itself. But for those of you joining us late, we began with a screening of the Reporters mini documentary, a companion piece to the K-Town 92 Interactive project. So Reporters does an excellent job of re-narrating the events of 1992 through the perspective of some of its actual storytellers, in this case, reporters and journalists of color working for the LA Times. To Yuri and Grace, what were your goals with Reporters, given that it is a more traditional narrative format as opposed to the online element? And how does it fit into the broader project then?
Mm-hmm. I can start with that. I mean, I had heard stories about the, I had heard, K-Town 92 is a storytelling project, and it really sort of puts the question back on who gets to tell this story, who gets to narrate history, whose version of the story gets to kind of live on, right? And that was something that I've been grappling with like over all these years as we search to find more interesting, more contextual stories about 1992 and how that happened. And so, when I think I had heard stories about like LA Times reporters, like maybe I had known about John Lee or something like that, and thought, oh, not everyone is going to be able to find this website. Like, is there a way that we could make a companion film, which is what our actual expertise is? It's not like making interactive web pieces that could kind of encompass a lot of the themes of K-Town 92, the website, that we could sort of, use as a way. It was actually broadcast on public television, but as a way to kind of bring people back to the site. I think over the years, like, the film was broadcast 5 years ago. This was all done for the 25th anniversary, but over the years, more people have just come across the site and sort of used it as its own kind of like, I think people have just become also more familiar with looking at stuff online in terms of this kind of interactive storytelling. It's almost like a deconstructed documentary, right? Yeah, Yuri, do you want to add anything?
Sure. I just think in the process of doing it, we just realized that we were meeting these people who all worked at the LA Times, and it was like, it felt like, yeah, you would encounter them on the website, but there was something very specific about their perspective as journalists. And like, I mean, we talked to probably all of the reporters of color who were there, you know, and like including the photographer, One. So it was like, this could be a very cohesive perspective from the like a media, because this was all kind of ingested worldwide through, you know, a very specific storytelling of local news. Essentially, there weren't like very in-depth pieces about it, right? It's like you saw the crying Korean women, you saw the Korean gun shop owner is a pretty familiar image, right, of him like, you know, holding the pistol and being in the parking lot trying to chase away looters and things. So it felt like, as we met all of these different LA Times former staffers, like there was a really like cohesive, succinct story that could get to the root of the question of the whole project, which, as Grace mentioned, was who gets to tell the story. And as we interviewed them, it was clear, like, yeah, we can incorporate them into the website, but having this short piece really was a way, like she said, to draw people in. But I think the central thesis of what we were trying to get at with the whole project is like, whose voices are elevated, whose are neglected, and how do we come to understand these historical events. And they, I think, each spoke to that very well. And so it's sort of like, it's almost like a capsule of that question and how to answer that question.
I think there's also like a saying, I don't know exactly what it is, but like journalists write the first draft of history. So all these people who are junior reporters contributing to the story, but not actually being able to, you know, command the story, I thought was interesting. And K-Town 92 aims to actually get like firsthand accounts from Angelenos, from Koreatown and beyond, to like talk about like what happened to them. So there's an interesting kind of perspective thing happening there. You know, like as someone who I wasn't in Los Angeles when the Saigu actually happened, but having lived here, we moved here shortly after, and like meeting people and sort of seeing the neighborhoods and like hearing everyone's stories, that, you know, you get a really different perspective from what's constantly replayed like at these anniversaries and on like the news footage. So.
Okay, thank you both. So I do see questions coming in via the Q&A. We'll wait on those for just a few minutes. I was thinking that now would be actually a good time to show the site to the audience for those who haven't perhaps seen it before. And for those who haven't, I think it's just ktown92.com. Is that correct? If they wanted to view it on their own during or after the presentation.
Yes, that's correct. Okay, so I'm sharing my screen now, which is the ktown92.com.
You make
and
it, or
sure. No, I mean,
or no?
Wait, what's the question? Was it small?
It's just taking up, we're taking up a lot of this space. So I don't know how to make it. I don't know how to do that. Sorry. It's okay.
Okay. Meaning it's not full screen?
On my end, it's full screen.
Oh,
I'm saying, yeah.
Okay.
Okay, good.
Okay. So once you go to the website, there's a quick slideshow of just various iconic images, and then there's a short trailer, which I'm actually going to skip, but we'll click on that.
This is not a test. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department
Sorry.
is now informed.
There was a day in March, I think the weekend after everything cleared out, and I honestly did not know what we were going into. It ended up at the park that's on
I'm trying
Normandy
to figure out how to
and
turn this
Olympic.
volume down a little bit, but it just sort of launches into one of the hundreds of video clips that we assembled for the site. And as it plays, it will start to
And,
populate with other
we
content.
will
So if
see
I hover with
2 days,
my
40
mouse,
hours.
I
They
can
could not
listen
go
to
to
this
sleep.
person speak.
I was just with
I
them.
field
can
or
figure,
the
I can
about,
go over here and listen to a
and
different clip
it
by
was kind of
Cat.
eerie stillness here.
And then if I
Which
choose
Burned
to
down or
listen to
robbed.
follow this
Reverend,
guy,
They, it was
this guy will
sickening how
become the
worried they were.
primary.
I mean, I felt sick watching
And
them just
one
worrying about their
aspect
store.
of this that
They
was
put in
important
the
to
last,
us
they've been doing
is
business for the
not
last
only
10
the
years.
keywords at the bottom,
And
but that we
this is their
have
livelihood. This is their
subtitles.
bread and
So
butter.
we
And
translated
they
every
didn't know
clip
if it
into
was gonna
Korean
survive
and
this
Spanish.
crisis or not. It was very, very,
Is that showing up?
I was very troubled to watch them worry about their store.
That function doesn't seem to be working, sorry. And the volume is a little bit wild here. So we did, oh, I see, okay. It seems like these main interviews are the ones that are translated, but we have Korean and Spanish for these, as well as the English. And then if you are tired of watching or you want to see what's next, you can click on next and it will populate you with a different option. So this is some archival footage at the time. So all the topics down here are also collected and correspond to, let me resize the window again, an index, which will list every single clip that we had assembled here. There are essentially 5 different pools of footage. There's 1992 archival, a lot of which we got from Visual Communications, which is an Asian American media resource here in Los Angeles. Some filmmakers and staff went out with cameras in the days after the uprising and just kind of filmed what they saw and did some informal interviews. There's 2017 archival, which was things that Grace and I, we went around just filming different contemporary things that seemed relevant in terms of events and places significant during the uprising. There's 1992 interviews that we have from Visual Communications as well. 2017 interviews that we conducted. And then if you go to YouTube, there's just like hours and hours of footage of people who apparently just taped VHS recordings of news playing, constantly. So a lot of this is just local LA news. So you can kind of get a sense of how things were being covered at the time. Like if you lived in LA especially, you would just see an extraordinary amount of just constant coverage of helicopter footage, of fires, of looting. And so it's meant to sort of be this historical record of what people were consuming at the time. And they all have tags. And so you can see how many clips we have under each keyword. But something that's interesting is, this is hard to explain, but the website, once you start watching, it keeps track of how many clips you watched during that session. So when it says all 6 out of 1,853, it means I've watched 6 clips and this is how they're tagged. So there's Korean American, looting, riots, women, and Koreatown. Couple other things here. There's just a map of like key events and things that was built out from the timeline of events. And you can find out more about all of the people that we interviewed in 2017 related to the project. Is there anything else you think I need to cover, Grace?
I mean, I just want to emphasize to people, when we created the project, it was really to kind of create a storytelling resource. And also, there's so many people, it's been 30 years since 1992, and so many people had no idea, no understanding, no idea that this had even happened. And so the way to kind of enter the site is really with like a sense of curiosity and like, you know, like how do you discover these, how this happened yourself, you know, like it's like one story leads to another. You might be interested in a particular topic. You might just sort of be intrigued by the way somebody looks, you know, and so like these 5 buckets of footage that Yuri, you know, pointed out, like this is a great way to sort of see like how we broke it down. And, you know, in many ways, the 2017 interviews are interacting with like the past and also, you know, the news footage to kind of almost intervene or kind of correct like some of these problematic images that we see where a newscaster is just narrating whatever the hell they see on TV rather than someone who's actually like living in the moment. I would just point out one thing when you look at the 2017 interviews, for example, you know, when you watch the reporter's film, there's a shot of the very famous shot of a helicopter, news helicopter footage looking down at Reginald Denny, who was the white trucker pulled from his truck and beaten in the street. So we all, at the time, we all saw that footage over and over again. But here, this Anita Wells, who was a middle schooler at the time, she tells a story about watching that happen at the corner of Florence and Normandy from her school bus. She was on her way home from school when this happened, and she witnessed it like through, you know, child's eye view through the school bus. And that's not an image, that's not a perspective that we ever hear about. And I think that's one of the kind of reasons like K-Town 92, I think is so, can be so powerful. It's like offering an alternate view of this event that gets often mediated through the news.
Thanks for that overview. I have several questions, but I also do want to make sure that there's enough time for the rest of the audience to pose questions as well. I will ask something as kind of a starter. You both mentioned that you are more familiar with the kind of traditional narrative formats, let's say documentary films and such. How did you envision people would use this website? Because with a documentary, you have a lot more control over how the message is being disseminated. With something like this, where there is like hours upon hours of just deconstructed raw film, I imagine there's much less control. So how did you envision people would not only come to your site, but then use it once they arrived?
I think I'll just say that one of the kind of themes of this event is that there is not a master narrative, right? And I think at the time at the 25th anniversary, there were these films, they're going to tell the definitive story of what happened chronologically. And there's definitely a place for that. But I think, you know, when your core question is like, who gets to tell the story? You know, we wanted that to be embodied in the structure of the site so that you choose who's telling the story. You actually have to, when you mouse over one person's talking to another person, you kind of have to silence that person, and it's its own kind of, something happens there too. Like you got to choose to go listen to that one and why, right? And hopefully, you know, you can kind of tag, you can see the tags below, like what it is that you're looking at, different categories and stuff. Yeah, I mean, that's my first answer.
Yeah, and I think for us, like that whole tracking system sounds very sinister when I say it that way, but like it's almost designed to show you like what are your own interests, right? Like I think Grace, you mentioned at one point your son just like got really into the news footage and he just wanted to watch like the fires or something, like in that part of the website. Yes, I'm just saying, but like meaning like you could afterwards, like each visit would be different, right? So like if you decided, oh, you know, I really am focused on kind of like what were the Korean Americans experiencing in Koreatown at the time, like you could actually just kind of generate an experience that was like primarily those voices. If you were specific and, you know, maybe you're like, oh, I want to hear more of the Latino voices at that time, because I think in some ways they are the most erased from the narrative when, you know, the population of Latinos in Koreatown and LA is huge, right? So it's like maybe like you're going to craft yourself a narrative from that perspective. So I think it was almost, it is a deconstructed and choose your own adventure, but it's also just kind of designed to show you like where are your own natural interests and like how does that influence your decisions. And you know, you can actually at the end see like, oh, I'm just really into this, you know, this kind of storytelling, or like this perspective is the thing that actually surprised me, and I just kind of went down the rabbit hole of that. So it's in the sense that like the internet is sort of an endless rabbit hole of information. This is at least like, I don't want to say curated, but I mean it is in a sense, right? Like we chose, even though there's a lot of clips, we still chose the sources from which they were drawn, and you know, we chose to interview very specific people in 2017. So I think it's like a combination of all those factors. It's like being able to pursue somebody's own interests, giving them sort of like a pool of media to wade through and follow their own. It's a curated rabbit hole, I guess. Is that like a?
And it's also random what every time you come
Right.
to the site, it starts differently, right? So
Yeah.
you know, it might start out with like Brenda Stevenson, who's a history professor at UCLA, or it might start out with some archival footage from a rally that happened in Koreatown, you know, a few days after. So then you just kind of like, there's always something, it's always going to be different every time you approach it, which I think is sort of matches kind of the themes, like who's telling the story, what's the perspective.
Yeah, and to that end, the fact that the clips are randomized in terms of like how you when you visit the site for the first time, for example, but you also have some level of control as to how you progress across the videos, I think has been a tremendous tool for me as a teacher, as an educator, in assigning assignments that then use this website, because especially when we are having discussions about like media studies, communication, like master narratives, discourse, and so on. This site, I think, does a really excellent job of showing students how you come to these sources, as well as how you engage with them, as well as your own positionality, has a very big role, plays a very big role in how these clips are interpreted. So it isn't only in terms of what you see, but also how you then interpret them as well. And that has led to a lot of really formative, constructive discussions within class. I'm curious, have you encountered any unique ways in which educators, activists, community organizers, and such have used and interacted with this website, with this project?
I mean, I think, you know, when we made it 5 years ago, and I think we were just so preoccupied with like getting it out and like being a resource and just sort of living forever as long as there's an internet. So it's great to hear your feedback, and I'd love to hear more. I know that there's someone named Terry Park who created a curriculum to accompany K-Town 92, which I think he's actually done a few workshops with leadership groups and, you know, youth organizations and things like that. I haven't actually heard the full download of how it went, but he says it's been really interesting. Yeah, I don't have the details, I'm sorry, but I think, yeah, I have to say, like, we made it very quickly. Like, we just wanted to make something almost like an intervention into the 25th anniversary. And so now that it's the 30th anniversary, it's interesting to see how it has become kind of maybe part of a curriculum, or like this week alone, I think I'm doing like 4 different panels related to K-Town 92. So yeah, I think it'll just, as time moves forward, I think, you know, it occurred to me, Yuri, that we should probably add more, you know, more interviews, because there's so many stuff come up, right?
Yeah. I think also for us, it would, like, I think when we were making it, like the Folder Studio, who's like an amazing group of tech and design folks, like they made this website for us. And honestly, like, I think they weren't born yet when all this happened, or they were very, very young. They were like under the age of 3. So like, it was almost like talking to them about the project and about all the things that happened, like was almost kind of an educational seminar, you know, like we'd go back and forth and they were like, wait, what? Like, we've never heard of this or we've never seen it. And so part of it is like the website educates, right, just on like the basic level of like these historical events, but then there's also this perspective from older people. Like I was in high school when it happened, and like it actually I had like a very interesting conversation with my parents, you know, that I had never talked to them about like race relations, you know, like in high school. But like, you know, for people who do have a memory of it or who lived through it, you know, it's like there's like a deconstruction and an analysis of like what is our understanding of these events. So it's like there's almost like two parallel sort of outcomes from the project, which is just like this is totally new for some people who just don't know anything about what happened. Because if you go to Koreatown now, I don't, if you're not in LA or you haven't been, it's like you would never know that, you know, there were millions of dollars of damage, or that, you know, these vacant buildings kind of were open for a while before development came back in. But if you drive into South LA, it is not the same kind of like center of commerce and, you know, hipness or, you know, entertainment, food that Koreatown is now. So I think, yeah, for me, it's like these two parallel ideas that like, you know, you're exposing a new audience to these historical events, and then you're also questioning your own understanding of these events as someone who lived through it or is trying to reflect upon it.
So on the topic of like having lived through this, I can share that I was 6 during the riots. I was very young, but this is also, I'd say, my first formative encounter with not just race, because I think, you know, children are exposed to race and racism at a much younger age, but more specifically race and racism as it relates to US race relations, and in a way that also then incorporates Asian Americans in a way that I had never seen before. So I think there's often a popular discussion how within the United States, race relations is understood as a binary, black and white. And in many ways, events like these help to complicate that binary. You've both mentioned briefly where you were during 1992. I was wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that a little bit more, and then also then consider or elaborate how where you were in the past when this actually happened perhaps informed how you engaged with this project when you were creating it, and also like if you learned anything new through the process. I imagine you did, but like I guess what did you learn through this process too? It's as like 3 questions in one.
Sure.
Yeah.
I'll start. I mean, I had just finished college and I actually was living in Korea, Seoul, Korea at the time. And I was at a friend's house, and all of a sudden somebody came in and say, look at the television, like, look what's happening, you know, and they started talking about King. It's not Martin Luther King, it's another King. And then, you know, all these images on Korean television of Koreatown and Los Angeles and LA was incredibly confusing and distressing to me, because also the way that it was framed on Korean television was as a Black riot. You know, I mean, I distinctly remember that. And I moved back to the States like not too long, maybe a few months afterward. And I think that the aftermath of what happened was really like there were so many different conversations and things happening around what happened in Los Angeles, 1992. It was, I think at the time, like the Village Voice called it the first multicultural riots, right? And as somebody, as I said earlier, I grew up in the Midwest, born and raised. I never saw Koreans on television. And so when you first see them on television and this is what you see, it's like profoundly affecting. And it was also it was around the same time I was getting interested in filmmaking. I was always interested in kind of journalism, storytelling, but it made me rethink. And a lot of people in my generation like thought like, oh, we've never seen ourselves in this way. We've never seen ourselves, period. And we've never seen ourselves in this way. What does this mean? What is our place in America? You know, like what is our role? And I think I sort of chose like the filmmaking, media making, storytelling role. Other peers like went to law, you know, or academia or wherever. But it was all very like, it was definitely a huge like marker for my development.
Thanks, Grace. It might actually be worth posing this question to the broader audience too, because we do have a chat function. The question I'd asked both Grace and Yuri was, where were you all during the uprising, during the riots, assuming that you were alive, of course. And if you were alive, what do you recall about it? Like, what are the lasting images that have stuck with you since 1992? How did it affect you, if it affected you at all? And if you wouldn't mind sharing your thoughts in the chat for those who are in the audience, that'd be wonderful. And then, sorry, Yuri, I think I interrupted you before you were about to speak.
No, it's totally fine. See, I must have been a freshman in high school at the time. And so I grew up in Connecticut, so very far away. So I didn't actually come to LA for the first time until I was in college. And like I mentioned, like I had kind of talked to my parents about what is this, like why are Koreans like shooting at people, and what's actually going on here. And they were just, it wasn't a very in-depth conversation. I think I remember my mom just being like, this is silly, like this has nothing to do with Korean people, or you know what I mean, it was sort of not dismissive, but it was like, this isn't like what we do, kind of thing. But my understanding of it came more in college when I took, American Studies classes. And so it was a very intellectual kind of academic relationship to what this was, right? Like talking about probably things that get discussed in sociology and history, right? Like in terms of race relations in history and things. But I think for me, working on this project, it was that leap between academic kind of engagement with these ideas of race relations into like, oh, these are people who were alive and experiencing it. And even though I knew that, obviously, as an intellectual thing, actually, like a lot of these people wept during our interviews, you know what I mean, like remembering some of these things that happened. And it was such like the people on the ground who were, post uprising, really trying to build those Black Korean kind of alliances. Like looking back now, it was like, I think maybe some people are like, what even, did anything substantive come out of that? Like what were the fruits of that energy and labor? And I think some people don't have a good answer, but the fact of the matter is, it's like it really illuminated something for a lot of people that people didn't really want to think about. Like, and I didn't want it to be focused on like, oh, there's a lot of Korean perspective. There's some Korean perspective where it's like, they didn't defend us, so we had to defend them ourselves. There's like a very strong like chip on some people's shoulders, which is, justified in the sense that, they had to watch their livelihoods burn to the ground. And I wanted to think about it, beyond that, like beyond the kind of like what was the material damage, but like what does this mean for our communities when we are so close together and living with each other and not understanding each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think I presented this to my child's middle school the other day, and I just had to remind people. I mean, for that generation, our kids' generation, my kids' generation, it's like the George Floyd video, right? Like the video of Rodney King being beaten by LAPD is like the first kind of citizen kind of recording of something that went viral before there was internet, right? It just like went all over, beamed across the globe. And then the images, of what happened in Los Angeles after the verdict, is sort of like, there are a lot of echoes of that in 2020, right? And so I think that in the 5 years since we made this project, it's actually kind of come to it. We're in a different space than when we made, K-Town 92 5 years ago. So the conversations are a little bit different, and the conversations are always going to evolve because, race in America is always going to, be a hot topic, right?
But it is like the same response, right? Like when the George Floyd related, protests and riots happen, like the focus was like, why are they looting? Why are they damaging their own communities? How is this helpful? It's like the same sort of like dominant question is like, why would you react this way? And it's like, because it's been 30 years, and like, we can't see substantive systemic change, right? And like, we're not really thinking about fixing these underlying issues of inequity, or like, we don't think about like, why do Koreans own liquor stores in impoverished communities? Like those aren't the questions that are being asked. It's, like, how are we going to protect ourselves? And, like how, and so I think what was really happening in 2020 for me was like, oh, like, why are we still have the same critiques, right? Or like mainstream media still has the same predisposition, right? Is to show the violence and to show angry people. And it's, in some ways it's like frustrating, but like I guess it's also illuminating to have this project, and like us being so intimate with this from 92 and like seeing 2020, it's like, it is kind of like what Watts was 68, it's like you kind of like see these cyclical things happening, and like people had mentioned Watts even before one of the interviewees, but like, yeah, it's more for me, it's like, you just want to like shake people and be like, we have done this before, and we just keep doing it over and over again, and like, how can we progress our conversations and our understandings of things?
So we're close out of time, but Yuri, the comments that you just stated, I think relate very closely to a question that we received from the audience just now from Aileen, where Aileen asks, do you feel that LA has forgotten about this event? And maybe I can add to Aileen's question, just think maybe more broadly to the United States, beyond LA even. And Aileen writes, I'm thinking of how many folks don't know about the Zoot Suit riots, where the LA Times also played a huge factor in controlling the narrative. And I'm thinking this will probably be your last question before we end today.
I think that's a hard question, because LA is, what is LA? Like that is such a huge question, representing so many, different kinds of people. I don't know if it's totally forgotten, but I do think there's definitely, like this week in Los Angeles, there's like many events, particularly in Koreatown, where I actually live, where they're kind of commemorating. I mean, this is a big anniversary, right? 30 years, but they're definitely much more like intersectional kind of conversations that are happening. And I think it's also looking back 2 years ago and like where we are now, because we're also having dealt with pandemic, George Floyd uprising, things like that. So I don't think it's I think it almost, I don't think it's forgotten, but I think it's more just something to discover for like a new generation, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you go into Koreatown, it's easy to not remember actively, right? Because there's just no evidence of it anywhere. I don't think it's like on the conscious brains of a lot of people, but I think it's something like the anniversaries are like that reminder that like, oh, this thing happened, and we revisit kind of these questions again. But I don't go into Koreatown on a weekly basis and think, oh, this is where this happened, or this is where this happened. So in that sense, like you could say it's forgotten in a way.
Yeah, I mean, it's similar to like, I was telling the middle schoolers, this is like, no one can fathom that nobody knows what, like we live in an era of like Squid Game and BTS, right? And everybody knows what Korean barbecue is and stuff. Like trying to compare like this shiny version of like Korean culture that's like colonizing the world, but underneath there's still like people alive who lived through like colonization and the Korean War and like military dictatorships and all kinds of stuff, so it's similar. Like I look at Koreatown now and it's like this happening place with restaurants and nightclubs and things like that, but nobody talks about like all the stores that were built afterwards that have no windows because they're almost like fortresses because of what happened in 1992. That's changing a little bit, but I think that lingers on for some
Yeah, so
Good.
it's almost like a collective amnesia, but every now and then there's something that happens that requires us to kind of have our memories jogged about
Yeah.
about those incidents. So we're well over time, so I'll stop us here. But I wanted to thank everyone who tuned in today, and of course, a special thanks to today's speakers, Grace Lee and Yuri Chung. A recording of today's talk will be available shortly after on the Glint website, and I'm happy to post that link onto the chat. Thank you to those who also responded to my initial question about where you were during the uprising in the chat as well. To everyone, please note that there are still 2 events remaining in the Revisiting to LA Riots 30 Years Later series, a virtual talk by Dr. Kyung Park of UCLA tomorrow from 12 to 1:30, also on Zoom webinar, and then a screening and discussion of Justin Chan's indie film Cook from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. on Friday at University Center 302. I hope to see you all at those other events. Before we end, I wanted to thank Grace Lee and Yuri Chung again. Thank you so much for joining us today and sharing some time with us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you.